Carolyn came out of the pastry shop, walked to the car, and noticed her husband standing on the sidewalk, looking somewhere in the distance. "David, why are you frozen? Come on, let's go. We're already late." "There's probably everyone already gathered at the table, only we're missing," she said in a disgruntled voice. It was as if David hadn't heard her. The woman couldn't stand it, so she walked over and tugged at his sleeve. He looked at her with a strange expression and then, as if reluctantly, headed for the car. Carolyn continued to grumble in the car, while David let his thoughts drift to the past, to a time before he was married to Carolyn, when he was still with Nicole. Nicole, a quiet, modest, and loving woman. She was his first love, his first wife. They were so happy until Carolyn crossed his path. And then Nicole died. She was in a terrible and ridiculous accident, and there was nothing David could do for her. He had only sobbed, hugging the coffin, begging Nicole for forgiveness. But even in those bitter days of hopelessness, he had no idea what he had truly lost. After Nicole was gone, he wasn't happy for a single hour, not even when Carolyn gave birth to his son. David felt like an outsider in his own family and often wondered when it had all gone wrong. Probably the day Carolyn appeared at the company where David worked. Elegant, long-legged, dressed tastefully, she held her head high and strode into the office as if she were not just a staff economist, but a director. At the time, David was the head of the department, and he often had to interact with Carolyn for business matters, sometimes staying late to finish paperwork. Then, one evening, their relationship crossed the line that should have remained between colleagues. The initiator was Carolyn. It was late, and they were the only ones left in the office, finalizing the company's profit figures. Suddenly, Carolyn stood up, stretched gracefully, and then walked over, sitting in David's lap. "What are you doing?" he whispered in shock. She silently untied his tie with her skilled fingers, unbuttoned his shirt collar, and pressed her lips to his. "Carolyn, I'm married," David protested, but she only grew bolder in her advances. David couldn't push her away. Meanwhile, faithful and loyal Nicole was waiting for him at home. David felt an overwhelming sense of shame, but he couldn't resist Carolyn. With each passing moment, his guilt deepened. Then, one day, Carolyn told him she was expecting a child. "David, you had to make a decision and choose between your wife and our baby. I hope you won't make the baby suffer." Only then did David fully realize what he had done. The passion Carolyn had ignited in him had nothing to do with love. Love, that was what he had with Nicole, and he didn't want to lose her. Yes, he had betrayed her, but maybe, just maybe, she could forgive him. "Carolyn, I'm sorry," David muttered. "Everything that happened between us was a mistake. I'm not abandoning the baby. I'll help you, of course, but my family is with Nicole." Carolyn had a tough temperament. She didn't cry like another woman might have. Instead, she smiled vindictively. "So, you want to remain a faithful husband? Do you really think your wife will forgive you, or has she already? Doesn't she have an ounce of womanly pride in her?" "No, I haven't talked to her yet," David admitted, shaking his head. "She's gone to visit her parents. I'll wait for her and tell her everything when she comes back." But Nicole never came back. 2 days after that conversation, her mother called. "David, Nicole was in a terrible accident. She's gone." "We'll bury her here," Mrs. Mitchell said firmly. "I want to be near my daughter. If you wish, you may come visit her grave." She said more, but David couldn't hear her. For days, he was in a fog. He barely functioned, his only moments of clarity coming when he collapsed over Nicole's closed coffin, sobbing bitterly. He had betrayed her, and now she was gone. Years passed. Now David was married to Carolyn. They were raising a young son. Today, they had traveled to a nearby state to celebrate the 50th anniversary of Carolyn's aunt. Upon arriving in town, Carolyn asked David to stop outside a candy store. While she was inside, David absent-mindedly looked around at the unfamiliar streets. Then, suddenly, his gaze fell upon a slender woman exiting the store across the street. David shuddered as if struck by lightning. It was Nicole. His Nicole. The same Nicole he had mourned for all these years. How many times had he secretly visited her grave, sitting there for hours, talking to her as if she were still alive? And now, there she was, alive. David wanted to rush to her, to call out her name, Nicole. But the words froze on his lips, his feet glued to the ground. Shock paralyzed him. He couldn't move. At that moment, Carolyn returned. David forced himself into the car with great effort. Lost in memories, he barely kept his eyes on the road. When they arrived at the celebration, Carolyn's family gathered at the table. David told her he wasn't feeling well and went to one of the rooms to rest. Finally alone, he could quietly immerse himself in his thoughts. A happy family with Carolyn had never worked out for him. Powerful and opinionated, she was not accustomed to taking someone else's opinion. The first 2 years of the birth of his son were a real nightmare for David. He hoped that the caprices of pregnant Carolyn would disappear when the baby came into the world, but as it turned out, it was only the beginning. Carolyn was demanding that David run to her at the first call, disrupting important negotiations. One day, she begged him to come urgently without explaining anything over the phone. David was going crazy with excitement for the child and drove home at such a speed that the wheels of the car barely touched the ground. But the door was opened by a smiling Carolyn. "You came. How nice," she said, a satisfied woman. "I missed you so much. What's wrong with our son?" David shouted, losing his temper. "Nothing. He's asleep. What could possibly happen to him?" "Carolyn, what are you doing? Do you realize that I had an important meeting and I dropped everything and rushed to you?" "That's good," she replied. "It means you love me." David, however, didn't love her. He had never loved her. There was only Nicole in his heart, but she was dead, or was she not dead? The thought overwhelmed David so much that he sat up abruptly on the couch. He hadn't seen her dead after all. The coffin was closed, and the funeral was kind of strange. David only now realized that Nicole's mother wasn't crying at all. At that time, he thought it was just shock. Now, he saw the whole situation quite differently. Exhausted by heady thinking, David collapsed back on the couch. When Carolyn stopped by to ask him how he was doing, he already had a plan. "Carolyn, I'm sorry. I have to leave right away." "Wait, tomorrow night we're going to a restaurant. It's my aunt's anniversary. There'll be a lot of guests." "I'll try to make it, I promise," David said, and despite his wife's displeasure, he got into the car and drove away. On the way, he stopped near a construction store, bought 2 shovels, some gloves, and a flashlight, and only then continued his way. He arrived at the cemetery where Nicole was buried in the evening when it was quite dark. He followed a familiar path to his wife's grave and began to dig it up. Not accustomed to physical work, David quickly rubbed blisters, but that didn't stop him. Hour after hour passed, and David kept digging, stopping only briefly to take a break. Finally, the shovel knocked on the lid of the coffin. David sighed heavily, only now realizing that he would not be able to get the coffin to the surface. His nerves, as well as his physical strength, were at their limits. So he decided to open the lid of the coffin right there in the grave. The shovel banged against the half-rotten boards, and a large gap appeared in the coffin. When he managed to tear off the lid, he wept bitterly, realizing that he had actually buried it several years ago. He even met Don sitting in the grave on the wreckage of a wooden coffin. In his hands were albums and photographs in which he and Nicole were young and happy. Here in the coffin, David found a box covered with scarlet velvet, which he himself had once given his wife. She kept all his gifts and small signs of attention he gave her in it. All of this meant only one thing: that day he didn't bury his wife, but her love and his happiness. After taking all the items from the grave, David somehow got the grave buried. Crushed by everything that had happened, he headed for the exit. Dying of exhaustion, he got behind the wheel, drank some water, and immediately, without driving away from the cemetery, he fell soundly asleep. On the evening of the same day, Carolyn was very angry when she realized that David did not come in time. She went up to her aunt and apologized for her husband. "I didn't expect anything else from him," her aunt grinned. "You know, I never liked your David. He doesn't compare to Mason." "Auntie, come on. You know Mason wasn't as malleable as David. When Mason found out that he got me pregnant, he demanded that I get an abortion. But I've already done it a few times, and the doctors warned me that this was probably the last chance for me to become a mother. I couldn't let it go. In addition, I wanted to get back at Mason, so I turned my attention to David." Carolyn laughed. "Oh, if you could have known how crazy Mason was when he found out that I started dating David." "So David has no idea he's raising a non-native son?" asked the aunt with a smile. "Of course not, he's so trusting." "Well, talk." The women didn't notice David, who came up from behind them with a huge bouquet of flowers. "Well," he said, "it's good to know that nothing needs explaining now." David handed the jubilee flowers to Carolyn and then turned around and walked away. Carolyn rushed after him, grabbed his arm, and began to beg him to listen to her. But he calmly pulled away from the weeping woman. Carolyn realized that she had made a mistake, one that could not be undone. David drove straight to Mrs. Mitchell's house and asked the question that had been worrying him. "Is Nicole alive?" "Don't keep quiet, Mrs. Mitchell. I know everything. I saw her, and at night I checked that she wasn't in the coffin. I love your daughter and have loved only her all these years." "David, if you loved her, then you wouldn't have cheated on her," Mrs. Mitchell replied. "How do you know that?" David looked up at her in shame. "One evening, when Nicole was just visiting me, she got a cell phone call. It was your mistress. She told Nicole that she was expecting a child from you and that you love her. Nicole didn't tell me anything at the time. She just went to her room. She was gone for a long time. I decided to look in and was horrified to see a handful of pills in her hands. She had already taken some, and I called an ambulance to save my little girl. Do you realize I could have just lost her?" David sat with his head low, and Mrs. Mitchell ruthlessly continued, "Oh, David, if you only knew how much she loved you. Then, in the hospital, she kept saying she didn't want to live anymore. I suggested that she talk to you, but she decided that since you had chosen someone else, she wouldn't bother you. You see, she decided to set you free. Rightly or wrongly, I supported her, even though I knew full well that one day the truth would come out and you find out. Where is Nicole now? I want to see her." "Why?" "To torture her again." "Please, David, don't disturb her life. I won't give her up to anyone." David shook his head. "I'll do anything to make her forgive me." "David, she loves you. She still can't get over you, but whether she'll forgive you, I don't know." Mrs. Mitchell sighed and gave her address. Hearing the doorbell ring, Nicole opened the door and immediately went pale as chalk. In front of her stood David, her first and only love, which she had never managed to erase from her memory. They stared at each other in silence, never taking their eyes off each other. Finally, Nicole pulled herself together and asked, "Why did you come?" "To tell you that I love you and always have. I made a terrible mistake once, and I'll never forgive myself for it. Nicole, I beg you every day to forgive me." "Go away. I don't believe you. You killed her love, and I buried it. Look what I have. This is proof. Our love cannot be buried." Nicole looked and recoiled when she saw the very photo albums and the scarlet box she had once buried. "Please, David, go away. I won't ruin your family. You have a child." "No family and no baby. She deceived me. He's not my son." "That doesn't change anything. So, once again, please go away." Bitterly, Nicole said and closed the door. But David did not move away. He lowered himself along the wall and sat on the floor, wrapping his arms around his knees. He knew firmly that he would do anything to get Nicole back and felt that there, behind the door, she was just like him, sitting on the floor and listening to the beating of her heart. He had been hurting. 3 years passed. David and Nicole were taking a walk in the park not far from their house. Little Sam was sleeping soundly in a stroller, which David rolled in front of him. He put his other arm around his wife's newly rounded waist. "Pearling, how lucky I am to have you in my life," David said, stopping and kissing Nicole. "I've been so stupid and blind, but now I will do anything to make you and our children happy, and I love you, David. You know, I felt so bad without you for those few awful years that Nicole. Please, don't remember. I won't forget for the rest of my life what I owe you." Nicole smiled, looking into her husband's eyes, and said, "Well, everyone in life can make mistakes." "Yes, but not everyone can forgive," David replied and hugged his wife again.